Oh, it's a blessing to see you, my brother.
Were you in Los Angeles or out in New York? Too. And we're almost on time with a hybrid event for you today. I'm Mark. I'm Executive Vice President and Provost here at Florida Gulf Coast. Can you, okay, is it working? Okay. No? Okay. Do we need to, maybe John, turn it up a little bit there, do a sound check. And I want to welcome all of our colleagues actually at University of South Florida, University of West Florida, and University of North Florida. So we are all over the state, literally with this event. So it's brought to you by the Office of Public Policy Events, and many of the staff are sitting in the audience here. I'm the director of the Office of Public Policy Events and proud to be so. And we're going to talk about two things today that are very important in American higher education. So we had two Supreme Court rulings this summer. One was about affirmative action and actually striking down affirmative action in the use to use race specifically in admissions criteria. It affected very few of the universities in the United States, but still, it begs the question, how do we achieve our diversity goals when some of the tools in the toolbox are taken away? The second one was a cessation of a Biden administration initiative to forgive hundreds of billions of dollars of student loan debt. How many students do we have today? All right, how many have debt? No hands. Okay, see, that's great. FGCU is a great place to be. Hardly any debt. But anyway, so that was controversial, and I think they'll probably still fight that one out. But it begs the question. It is getting more expensive to live here in Fort Myers. We all know that. So even though our tuition is low, the cost of living is. How do we make higher education affordable and accessible for all the students that need a good education to get ahead today? So that's what we're going to talk about, and I'm so pleased that actually the technology worked. And we have Cornel West, Robert George from Princeton University. They're joining us virtually. And we're going to have a moderator. It's not going to be me. It's going to be Dr. Christopher Phillips. And I'll give a brief introduction of him and then have him come up and go through the debate. The format will be that Christopher will pose questions to our two distinguished guests. For 30 or 40 minutes, Chris, I think, and then we will take your questions. So there are microphones in the room, and then at USF, UWF, and UNF, you can type into the chat pod or whatever pod it happens to be on our technology here. And Julie and I will read those questions to Chris, and he'll deliver those to our distinguished debaters. So Christopher Phillips, we wouldn't be here today with these two without Christopher Phillips. He is the founder of the Global Socrates Cafe movement, which is a philosophical society that has had branches spring up of Socrates cafes around the world, right? And places like community and cultural centers, libraries, military bases, universities, coffee houses, hospitals, prisons, and other virtual platforms. He delivers these types of programs. He's authored a lot of different books. He has copies of his most recent book with him, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a little bit. But most prominently, Socrates Cafe, A Fresh Taste of Philosophy, which has been translated into many different languages and shared throughout the world. 6 Questions of Socrates, a modern-day journey of discovery through world philosophy, and Socrates in Love, A Child at Heart. Speaking of children, he also has authored children's books, right, Chris? And he's got a few of those that are out there. His latest book is called Soul of Goodness. We have copies here if you want to take a look at that. And Chris is officially a designated speaker with the speaker program of the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs. Help me welcome to the stage, Christopher Phillips.
Thank you so much. It's such a joy and honor to be here. I want to say before I say anything else that Brother Cornel West wrote the gorgeous foreword to my newest book, Soul of Goodness.
We're at an ABM. We're at a very low point. I'm here in New York City at Union Seminary. I just walked out of my apartment, run right into the New York Post. Oh, Brother West, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to have a dialogue, Brother Robbie, Brother Chris. We have a question for you. Hey, Professor Joseph so-and-so said something about, did you think you ought to be fired on the spot? I said, well, I don't know what he said, but I don't think he needs to be fired on the spot. People have a right to be wrong. We can wrestle with it. Let's have a debate. Let's have an intellectual engagement about it. No, the student petition, one petition says he's fired on the spot, another petition says he's speaking the truth. Oh my God, is this where we are? Well, we've been there for a while, and we've been there before. We treated communists that way in the 50s. They treated a number of black folks for a long time in the history of white supremacist institutions, putting down women's voices. We've got a lot of different versions of this, but I think what Brother Robbie is talking about here, I just have not just profound agreements with Brother Robbie, but I have deep, deep love for my brother when he's right and when he's wrong. I love him. I respect him because he's committed to integrity, honesty, decency. What happens to those virtues? Civic and personal. How do you hold on to them? Only by enacting them, only by embodying them, only by becoming concrete, fleshified examples for the younger generation to see. Oh, I see. There's still some holy fools around. I use the language from Dostoevsky. Those folk who are foolish enough to be in the world but not of it. Foolish enough to bear witness to a moral and spiritual witness that is pushed to the margins in a moment of hatred and greed and polarization and gangsterization. So the issue of character, virtues, is primary moral and spiritual dimensions of who we are as human beings and who we are as educational institutions. And then, of course, we can get to debates about whatever it is, affirmative action, student loans, and so forth and so on. But without those virtues in place that generate a trust, that generate a zone where there can be Socratic conversation to learn and listen from one another, then all we have is just might versus right. Might determining right, I should say. Might making right. Power dictating what is the case. And at that point, we're in a wholesale barbarism. And it comes in all colors: black, white, red, yellow, brown, male, female, trans, gay, lesbian, every nation. It's a human thing.
Thank you.
Chris, could I add something to the assembly? Often we're tempted to think, people are tempted to think, living in this blessed democracy, that if we've got democracy, we're golden, right? We've got democracy, we've made it. But democracy is not a guarantee of justice. What was the form of government that murdered Socrates? Love your work, Socrates Cafe. He is our hero. The Socratic way is the right way. Who murdered our hero? It was a democracy. It was Athenian democracy that killed Socrates. And how do things like that happen even in a democracy? It's when people existentially come to suppose, no matter what they'll tell you with their mouths, existentially, they operate from the assumption that their views are infallible, that they know the truth, the whole truth, nothing left to learn. Anybody who disagrees with me is a fool or an ignoramus or a bigot or a bad person or a Nazi or a communist, and therefore needn't be listened to but can be shut down. Cornel tells the story being asked by the New York Post just today, should this professor be summarily fired for something he said, whatever it is he said. That attitude that people should be fired, people should be canceled, people should be, set out, sent out of the universe because they dare to challenge a sacred opinion. That is toxic to democracy. We need to recognize existentially, not just notionally, not just admit the words, but really truly understand that all of us, no matter how brilliant, no matter how gifted, no matter how good, are fallible. We can be wrong, and wrong not, again, just about the minor, superficial, trivial things of life, but about the big and important things. And when we recognize that, then we will acquire one of the virtues that is absolutely indispensable to truth-seeking and to maintaining Republican government, and that is the virtue of intellectual humility. That's what's missing. Intellectual humility. along with what Cornel calls the enabling virtue, courage. That's what we need to muster. That's what we need to get back. Intellectual humility so that we're willing to listen to somebody else. We're willing to not only challenge other people, but be challenged ourselves, willing to change our minds, willing to entertain argument, and then the courage to live that out.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, as I know Brother West knows, I have both U.S. and Greek citizenship, and I just got back from Athens, as well as the tiny volcanic island of Niceros, where my family's from in the South Aegean. And I held a Socrates Cafe right on the Agora of old, where Socrates held forth. But it also made me think, you know, where I held now is in ruins. It's just a shadow and shell of what it once was. This is something that's a museum piece. And so it made me think about how most open societies have a period of ascent, then stasis, and then decline. And so today we're looking at, in the context of American democracy, the two topics that professors here at Florida Gulf Coast University wanted to explore: affirmative action and student loan repayment or forgiveness. And looking at these issues in the context, in the greater context of democracy, I want to know first on the theme of affirmative action, if you think that the Supreme Court ruling will further the ends of a democratic society like ours. Justice Roberts, in writing the majority ruling, said it was about creating a colorblind society. Or is that almost beside the point? Is the point about creating a society that celebrates colors, thinking in colors, skin colors? And does effacing race as a criterion for admissions into college universities, does it further the ends of an open society like ours, or do you think it's a detriment to the ends at this particular juncture?
You want me to jump in, Brother Robbie?
Yeah, that'd be fine, Cornel. You
Sure, absolutely. Well, one, I think we have to acknowledge that, you know, we don't look to the Supreme Court to have to protect the rights of precious Welsh and Irish and Italians and Germans and so forth, because we worked it out civically. There was anti-Catholicism cut very deep when our Polish brothers and sisters made their move here and Italians made their move. But we didn't have to go to the Supreme Court for that. The very fact that we have to look to the Supreme Court is an acknowledgement of what Brother Robbie meant when he talked about that second moment, the Civil War. Race, the vicious legacy of white supremacy, cut so deep in the country that we led towards 750,000 precious human beings who died, each life precious, to do what? One side wants to support Black enslavement in perpetuity. That's the Constitution of the Confederacy. And God bless our brothers and sisters in Florida. They know the history. They live the history. It affects every state, but the South had an intimate connection because they constituted the Confederacy. Then you had the North trying to break the back of the Confederate Army in those barbaric times. So the very fact that we had to go to the Supreme Court in the 60s meant that we had a major impediment for possibilities of American democracy, which was legacies of white supremacy. It took barbaric forms of lynching and so forth. It took softer forms of individual prejudice, which was ugly, but different than hanging folk from trees. It took institutional forms of discrimination. It took intellectual forms of universities, colleges, churches, whole host of institutions claiming Black people less intelligent, less moral, less beautiful, and so forth. And this is a history. This is not to be said to get us stuck in the history. This is what we have to come to terms with. And when affirmative action was put forward, it said, well, for all of these years, affirmative action was white, to use the language of Ira Katz Nelson. Let's broaden the pool. Now, unfortunately, there was a confusion and a conflation between diversity and quality. See, affirmative action never meant less qualified Black people gaining access to positions. It meant broadening the pool of those who were qualified. And then you make your choices based on that pool. And for a long time, Black folk were qualified in that pool, but never had access to universities or various institutions in not just the South, but in the country as a whole. And then it shifted to the diversity about 20-some years later. It's no longer affirmative action in the sense of repairing past injustices. It became diversity. And then now they said, well, that would work last about 20 years. 20 years later, that's gone. So the question now becomes, what do we do to both affirm our common humanity, acknowledge our history, and come up with something that is fair and just? Now, I don't think there's a formula for this. I really don't. I think it's practical wisdom. We're working it out step by step, stage by stage. I've always been one who argued for both class and race because I thought, in fact, that in the end, when you get a third generation Black persons whose parents were upper class, that they didn't deserve the same exact attention of a poor white who come from West Virginia or Kentucky and so forth, because you're talking about socioeconomic disadvantage. But there had to be a combination of both, I always thought. But at the moment, things are in the air. I'm sorry to go on so long, though.
No. Thank you so much for that. Brother Robbie?
Yes, Chris. I think the answer to your question, where does this leave us? It's going to be better, it's going to be worse, is entirely up to us. Cornel put it absolutely correctly at the end when he says it's a matter of practical wisdom. There's not a formula. Will we make the right decisions moving forward? Now, let me fill in. That's very abstract. Let me fill in what I think is going on here. What we need to do, I think we can learn from what Brother Cornel said in the chapter on affirmative action in his magisterial book, Race Matters, which I assign in my civil liberties course every year. In that chapter, he says, the ideal approach is affirmative action based on class, socioeconomic affirmative action. I'm willing to accept race in as much as it is a rough surrogate in our country, given our historical circumstances, as Cornel explained, for class. What the Supreme Court has said is that we can no longer now take race into account just as such. In other words, race can't count in favor of or against any particular candidate. That candidate's race can't be counted for him in admissions, can't be counted against him in admissions. It does not prohibit affirmative action or classifications based on socioeconomic class. And if we adopt a system that is meant to identify the best talent, irrespective of socioeconomic condition, so that we are able to reach out to those young men and women all over the country of all races and colors and creeds and conditions, and find those who, as a result of their modest circumstances, have not had the opportunities that wealthier students have had, but have the talent, and all they need is an opportunity. We can bring them in. Now, it might be that they're going to be disproportionately, let's say, Black and brown, and that's fine. If that turns out to be true, that does not violate anything that the Supreme Court has said. It also solves the problem that gave rise to the specific litigation that we're talking about, the Supreme Court cases that we're talking about, which are the North Carolina and Harvard cases brought by students for fair admissions. And that is the problem of potential discrimination against Asian Americans. Dozens and dozens of Asian American groups joined in the lawsuits because they believed and had statistical data to show that Asian students were being disadvantaged by our current admissions preferences programs. If we do it on a class basis and not on race or ethnicity, and we do it right, we're not going to victimize or discriminate against Asian Americans or anybody else. Now, here's the trouble. This is going to take work, and it's going to take work on the part of universities. It's much easier for universities if they can just say, oh, okay, this student is black, he gets these extra points, boom. This student is brown, he gets these extra points, boom. This student is Asian, no extra points. This student is Croatian, no extra points. That makes things easy. Universities are now going to have to do the hard work of actually identifying those students who got what it takes, who got the talent, but have never been given the opportunity and really just need the opportunity in order to rise to the top. So we're going to have to work to do it. We can't take the easy way out, those of us in university life. But I think it's worth doing. And I think if we do it that way and we do our jobs correctly, we're going to actually come out of this ahead. We're not going to lose diversity because talent is not distributed by race and ethnicity. It's just not. Skin color doesn't determine how smart you are. I mean, there are people who believe stuff like that, but it's not true, right? So we need to find the talent and give that talent the opportunities that they need in order to flourish. And I don't see any reason at all why we can't do that.
Okay.
Of course, it'd be easier to take the easy way and just look at a person's skin color and give some points one way or another. But, you know, the Supreme Court's right. That's actually not fair. What we really need to do is find the talent. People have been held back because their circumstances have not permitted them to have the advantages, the leg up that students from wealthier backgrounds. Again, whether the wealthier students are black, white, green, red, purple, doesn't matter.
Right.
You know, it just doesn't make any sense. As Cornel suggested, it just doesn't make any sense.
Well, just
give an advantage to a black banker's son from Scarsdale, and to not give an advantage to a white coal miner's daughter from Eastern Kentucky or West Virginia. Right? That doesn't make any sense. It's easier for colleges. They'd like to take the easy way out. But if you're really looking for where the talent is, you're going to be wondering, is this young woman from Appalachia someone who could be just as good as this student from Scarsdale, or even better, but just hasn't been given the opportunities?
Okay. Well, let's look at let's don't separate the issue of student loan repayment and forgiveness from this. I was recently in Memphis, Tennessee, holding at this new dialogue initiative I have called Cafe for Shakespeare. And they were talking about how there seems like Memphis is becoming legally desegregated now, you know, by housing, by class disparities that are growing in schools because people who are black are making less income. So they can't, and then they have to go into onerous debt, no matter what their scores tend to be, to go on to college. And so Justice Roberts wrote the ruling, and he says many universities have concluded wrongly that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Can't we? But if we're still in a society that's not colorblind, can't one of the principal challenges, in fact, still be the color of one's skin? Brother Webb?
Oh, no, I mean, there's no doubt that racism cuts very deep in a society that's founded on vicious attacks on indigenous peoples and African slavery and so forth. So these things are going to have lingering effects that to me are undeniable. The question is that how do we confront them in such a way that we don't allow them to have the last word? See, that's the question. And to not allow them to have the last word simply means that somehow we're still going to try to keep track of the deeply human things that they share with other human beings, even given the ugly circumstances with which they have to come to terms with past and present. And that has to do with character and talent and things that people shape and mold under whatever circumstances. And in that regard, I've always thought that, the Black musical tradition, I think more and more is going to become the real source of a certain kind of salvation for American democracy. Because it's there where, the New Orleans and the Chicago's vicious Jim Crow, unbelievable greed and hatred coming at Black folk, and yet all of this style and genius and talent still generated because they had access to certain things that allowed them to have the self-confidence, allowed them to cultivate their talent, and in some cases, the Louis Armstrongs and Sarah Vaughn's, their genius.
Mhm.
And that had nothing to do with just skin pigmentation.
Mhm.
It had to do with human beings under ugly circumstances making certain kind of choices to rise at the highest level of arete, of excellence. And the question becomes, how do we translate that kind of sensibility into our politics, into our civic life? The problem of our universities these days, and Brother Robbie and I talk about this all the time, is that it's become so commodified and corporatized and bureaucratized that the students are treated as if they're consumers, and the universities are acting like they're offering a commodity. And you say, well, wait a minute.
I see a lot of head nodding here.
Particular uses in certain spheres, but not here. Not here. And once that is unleashed, and that has been unleashed, then it becomes a money question. And the students don't have the money, so they have to go to the banks, and the banks make money based on the interest. And lo and behold, even my dear brother Robbie's got some powerful arguments in defense of capitalism. We wrestled with it for 20 years, Frederick Hayek and the others. And he knows the difference between market capitalism and crony capitalism. He knows the difference between market capitalism and oligopolistic, monopolistic capitalism. But once it takes over those realms of the civic and the spiritual and the moral, Lord, we're going to end up with a younger generation obsessed with trying to make it from womb to tomb with suicide and drug overdoses and deep crisis and depression and unbelievable anxiety and ennui, a whole host of things, which is where we are right now.
Let me make a point that I think shouldn't be overlooked, and that is that nothing in the Supreme Court's rulings in the racial preferences cases, the affirmative action cases, forbid race being taken into account where, in an individualized assessment of a student, the student's experiences based on race are considered. In fact, Chief Justice Roberts, in the opinion for the majority, the 6-member majority, makes the point that this is certainly permitted. He goes out of his way to say that it's permitted. So that if one's experience, irrespective of one's race, again, it could be a white person who's talking about some challenge that that person had to meet because of his particular race. Let's say he was a white person who was brought up in some community that was overwhelmingly Latino or overwhelmingly Asian or Black or whatever it was, and what adjustments, what challenges he faced. That can be brought to bear. The same with a Black student, the same with a Latino student. Universities can and should, in assessing the ability and the potential and the promise of a student, inquire into what challenges has the student faced, what challenges has the student met. That tells us something about what that student is made of. Where race does figure in that story, that can be told, and it can fully be taken into account in the admissions decision. But the key thing is it's got to be individualized. You can't simply give people points based on race with no other factor considered, nothing about how race affected this person's life or didn't. Now, here's where the danger is there, Chris and Cornel. Here's my worry with that. That could be treated as almost a virtual invitation for every student of every color, every ethnic background, every race, for every student to write an admissions essay in which that student emphasized his disadvantages and victimhood in some sort of a contest to see who can depict themselves as the bigger victim. We don't want that. We don't want that. We don't want students to internalize the idea that in order to get admitted to Harvard or Princeton or the University of Florida or Ohio State or whatever it is, you got to show that you're a bigger victim than the next guy. That's not a good thing. At the same time, we do want students who have faced challenges, including those who face challenges precisely based on race or ethnicity, to be able to tell their story and have that story fairly, on an individualized basis, assessed for admission.
Brother Cornel, do you think That's true that we no longer need to make race a factor in decisions for admissions, that we can still achieve experiential diversity, political diversity, class diversity without taking that into account.
See, I think that we're going to end up implicitly and indirectly taking race as a factor no matter what. The question is whether we do it wisely, whether we do it fairly. Why? Because race cuts through every dimension of American life. It really does. Now, the other option you could do is to say, well, I don't want you to write an essay on your individual story or personal experience. Write an essay on Shakespeare's Hamlet. Write an essay on Sophocles' Antigone. Write an essay on James Baldwin's Fire Next Time. Let's see how you connect as a human being. Of course, you're already raced and gendered, and you, the human being in the life of the mind, which ought to be the fundamental focus of the universities and colleges, which unfortunately is less and less the case. That's part of the commodification of the universities, right? You're appealing to the individual experience of the consumers, the students. Whereas the subject matter that needs to be wrestled with is a subject matter that takes you out of your individual experience so you can return to your individual experience in a broader, more universal way. Unfortunately, that model has been pushed to the mark. When Robbie and I were coming along, and I'm much, much older than Robbie.
Not much.
He's more handsome, but I'm older than the brother, you know what I mean? But when we were coming along, we were asked to write an essay. We wrote an intellectual essay. That's what it was to get into school. But things have become so thoroughly tied to the individual experience, personal experience, how people feel, and so forth and so on. That become the subject matter. So, and then we wonder why paideia, we wonder why deep education is not reduced to this cheap schooling with identity sensibilities. Oh my God. This is what we mean by the nadir at the intellectual, spiritual, and moral level, even though that does not deny, of course, the ugliness of the oppressions of the past and present.
Cornel, I checked into something the other day just to refresh my own memory. I looked at what it cost my parents to send me to college my freshman year. I went to Swarthmore College, as Cornell knows, private institution, small liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia. And my freshman year, which was fall of 1973, the college had just breached the $4,000 a year level. It had just gone over $4,000. So it only took $4,000. Now, my father had to struggle to find that $4,000 to send me to college. It wasn't easy, $4,000. But then I looked to see what $4,000 is worth today. What would that be in today's money? And the answer is something like between $28,000 and $32,000. Now, wait a minute, I said to myself, hang on. Swarthmore College today, or Princeton University, or Harvard University, costs something like $80,000 or $85,000.
Exactly.
Why shouldn't it cost $28,000 to $32,000? That's what $4,000.
Exactly.
Inflation goes way beyond the consumer price index, way beyond the value of money in those days, dollars. Now, what has happened? Cornell put his finger on the bureaucratization, the commercialization, turning this into a consumer products business. With the student as the consumer and the college as the provider of goods, and putting all these layers and layers of bureaucracy between the student and the professor, which not only adds unreasonable expense for which they got to borrow money, because who's got $85,000 today? And if you got more than one kid in college, my goodness. Now I realize it's a lot less expensive at state universities, including those in Florida, and you've got great state universities like yours. But still, who's got the kind of money that you need to educate a child today, especially if you have more than one child? So it's not just that it's expensive. It's that it damages education, because when you put bureaucracies between the student and the professor, you lose something of value educationally. I'll tell you right now, for example, if a student of mine needs an extension on a paper, I don't hear from the student. Student doesn't come to my office hours and say, Professor George, my great aunt Matilda died, and the funeral is next Thursday, and the paper's due on Friday, and I've got to attend the funeral. Could I have a couple of extra days? I hear from some dean. Now somebody's paying the salary of that dean. It's between me and the student. And it's not that I want to deny the poor kid the right to attend, the opportunity to attend Aunt Matilda's funeral. The result's going to be the same either way. The kid's going to get the extension to attend Aunt Matilda's funeral. I just use that as one little example of the ways in which bureaucratization not only adds unreasonably to the expense, thus burdening the student, but also impedes, interferes with something precious that is necessary to the educational experience, that student-faculty relationship.
I'm also thinking about the democratic experience. When I went to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg and graduated a lifetime ago, I had to take out a loan, but it was affordable. And I was able to take a very unique path in life and start Socrates Cafe. If I went there now, the debt would be so massive. I mean, so far ahead of any factoring inflation. I couldn't chart out a course like this that might help create foment a more open society. I mean, what do we do to bring things into control that, students can get out of school regardless of their socioeconomic status and take on creative lanes and paths in life at a time when our democracy is so polarized?
It's a wonderful question, man. A wonderful question. I mean, I think on the one hand, Brother Robbie and I have students who can graduate from Princeton and make $250,000 the first year after college, going straight into financial services.
Yeah.
So that, unfortunately, the commodification of the university is tied to the commodified perceptions of the students who not just have money on their mind, but money becomes a fundamental driver and motivation of their life choices. Now, they may get there and burn out after 2.5 years with $500,000 in the bank or so, because the bonuses can be 15 and 20% more than their salaries. Right? So that on the one hand, with spiritual burnout, even though you got cash flow and you're still paying your loans, but then the vast number of students who are middle class, working class, tied to community colleges and so forth, they're both bearing tremendous burden and then looking for jobs that can be very difficult to find. And so the question becomes, how in a society where the demos, the public and public life, public education, public conversation, public relations and interactions as citizens, not just as bearers of identity, not just as bearers of a religious sensibility, but as citizens, qua citizens. Where is that manifest? Because if it's not manifest, then you lose. I mean, John Dewey makes that point in his classic of 1927, The Public and Its Problems. He says, show me a democracy that can no longer generate quality public spaces and public ways of being in the world, and I'll show you a democracy that is undergoing dissolution. Now, of course, we've always got the army, and that's very important. It's very important because it's clear that even democracies give the highest priority to their military. And the military is not subject to the marketplace. No. You got a little socialist sensibility there. You got public concern, public authority, public change of command to ensure that the most essential thing of a democracy, which is to protect that democracy, is not subject to arbitrary market sensibilities or market forces. It's got to be integral to the nation state reproducing itself. And it's interesting that one could argue, other than in the music, in the history of the country, the military plot in regard to race relations has been much more on the cutting edge than most of the other social spheres, with the exception of music and entertainment.
Chris, the universities and colleges around the country have operated as rational actors. Widespread, widely available, federally guaranteed loans have functioned essentially as invitations to universities to raise prices and to expand bureaucracies. You can hire more because you can charge the students more. You can charge the students more because they've got the loans, but the student ends up with the debt. You know?
Yeah.
Colleges and universities are not blameless in this. It's a mistake to think there are two actors. There's a student and the government. There's a third actor. It's the college and university. And they're going to act in their own rational self-interest too a lot of the time. You know,
Right.
and that can have very adverse effects for the student and for the public.
And for democracy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, I want to thank you so much. I want some others now who are participating or listening in to your great insights to what are some questions that we have. There's other colleges also participating online, and I want to invite some questions from the audience and from others who are listening online. Mark, how do we do that? Can you come up here yeah, okay. So we have some other questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Wonderful.
All right, we don't currently have any online questions, so if anybody in the audience has a question. Y'all all are shy?
Here we go. I don't think so.
Thank you, gentlemen. This is wonderful dialogue, and I want to start by saying we all need that safer discourse, some areas where we have to agree, But Robert, I have this question. I think you're making it a bit too simplistic to divorce a very strong marriage between race and socioeconomic status. And Cornel talks about it and said, we can't. This country is bound, the two of them are bound together. Even if you don't like those S's, when the children from the black and the other communities, minorities, don't get a chance to express themselves and know that there's a system that supports them, they're not going to get there. But I think it'd be too simplistic to think we can just give an equal playing ground when historically it has always been unequal and it is not equal ever, please.
Well,
So, was there a question?
are we not on? Want me to respond?
Yes.
So the final question is, how do we move forward when the system is so deeply entrenched where race and socioeconomic status are one and the same thing?
So how do we move forward in a system that is still so deeply entrenched? Race, socioeconomic status. How do we move forward when we can't tease them apart and it's still keeping people down? What are your thoughts about that?
I think Brother Robbie was responding, then I'll say a word too.
Sure, sure.
Okay.
I think the questioner thinks that my solution is simplistic.
Okay.
Perhaps he's right. It's possible that I'm wrong about this. But nevertheless, it seems to me the right solution, and that is individualized assessment. An individualized assessment, as Chief Justice Roberts himself says, can take race into account where it's relevant to the challenges that a student has met. And that's how we recognize the fact that there's a history here. Now, there is a history of invidious discrimination. There's a history of worse than invidious discrimination. And where that history continues to create challenges for students, those challenges can be taken into account, but it's got to be done on an individualized basis. There's no perfect system. There's no algorithm that'll work here. There's no formula, as Cornel said. But this is the way, by individualized assessment, that we can both do justice to the challenges students have faced, including those they've faced in virtue of their race or ethnicity, and at the same time avoid unfairness to other students, especially as in these cases, those of Asian students who are disadvantaged by the system as it was operating. Not perfect. It's the best we can do. And if we do it, it's pretty good. And if we do it, we are going to have diverse classrooms. Those classrooms are by no means going to be all white. No way. They're going to be very diverse. They're going to be East Asian, South Asian, Latino of many, many different descriptions, Black, Indigenous, white, many, many different descriptions, not just people of English or German heritage, but of Bulgarian and Greek and Russian. There'll be students of all different perspectives because talent, or all different backgrounds, because talent isn't distributed by race and ethnicity. But we've got to do individualized assessment to see where the talent is latent. Sometimes it's right on its face. Other times it's latent. It was in my case, growing up in the hills of West Virginia, believe me. You know, it was not clear that I was going to make it. I had a very tough first year. It wasn't clear to me I was going to make it in my first year in college. I was so far behind the other students.
Right.
Had everything to do with my socioeconomic background. But by individual assessment, we can discover that latent talent, but it takes work. And colleges and universities would prefer to have the easy way out.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate the challenge of our dear brother talking about just how deeply entrenched both legacies of white supremacy are and forms of class as well. And of course, gender has been a very important dimension of this when you talk about affirmative action too. But I think our point, though, my brother, was that when you take someone like myself, now I grew up on the chocolate side of the ghetto in Sacramento, California, and then related to my daughter, who was like a niece to Uncle Robbie here, that she had access to privileges, benefits that I did not have. Right? She's the daughter of this particular brother teaching at Princeton. You see, I was the son of Irene and Cliff, hardworking, magnificent human beings who did not have the same kinds of benefits that I would have later on in life. So that the question becomes, well, then, as much as race and class are entrenched, there's no way the daughter of a member of the Black bourgeoisie like myself somehow is has the same chances as a very, very poor white sister living in Appalachia. You just can't make that case. That doesn't mean that racism isn't still ugly. It doesn't mean that racism equals class. It just means that the relation of race and class is so inextricably interwoven that it could still produce relatively wealthy Black folk like myself as professor at Union Seminary or Harvard or Yale, with a magnificent daughter who works hard and so forth and so on, and has a right to gain access to college, but she should be more privileged than someone who's in less beneficiary, in more adverse circumstances. I mean, that's the claim I think we're trying to make.
You know, Cornel, I was just thinking the other day, as you know, I knew your beautiful mother, Irene West.
Oh, yeah, Mom.
And, you know, Irene West was a highly educated, deeply cultured woman. She spoke beautifully. She was familiar with great works of literature and so forth. My mother doesn't speak so beautifully. I love my mother very much. But
she's magnificent.
Cornel knows my parents. Knows my parents.
Yes, absolutely.
She can't speak perfect English that way, and she's not familiar with the great works of literature. You know, Cornel comes from a much more highly educated background than I come from, and that is just a personalized version of what Cornel was talking about when he was contrasting, you know, the situation for his own daughter, for Zaytoon, my beloved niece who's here at Princeton with us.
She got the latest note too, though, brother.
Oh, she got my latest note. I was worried about her, so I remember. So, and contrasting, you know, Zaytoon's situation, you know, the daughter not only of a relatively affluent person like Cornel, but the daughter of somebody with a PhD from Princeton and an undergraduate degree from Harvard with a tremendous educational background, and the daughter of a miner in Eastern Kentucky or in West Virginia, where, of course, there was no history of education. You would have no sense of the culture of education. You wouldn't know how to apply necessarily to a college. So these are the things that I think militate strongly in the direction of individualized assessment to the extent that you can, because there will be that latent talent there, but you got to work hard to discover. You have to make an effort.
Thank you for that. Yes, please.
So first, I'd like to commend you on what I would say is probably one of the most congenial debates I've ever experienced.
But I'll have to put that in quotes. One of the most congenial debates I've ever experienced.
So you both emphasized the dramatic increases in the costs of education, and you've both been affiliated with institutions that probably are richer than the majority of nations in the world. And we're here in a state that has a pretty hefty budget as well. And so I'm wondering whether it's private or public, given the costs of education, what are the responsibilities these days of wealthy institutions to ensure the affordability of education, and to ensure that our students aren't going out into the work world needing that consumerist mentality because they've had to focus their education on the nature of the job that they're going to get when they leave college?
Wonderful question. Rob, you want to jump in?
Well, let me give it a start, Cornel, but this is one you really need to weigh in. So Princeton's an example of an extremely wealthy university. I think our per capita endowment is the largest in the country. It's not in absolute terms the largest. I think either Harvard or Texas is the largest, but per student, Princeton's is the largest. And I highly approve of what our university has done recently, which is very significantly increase the financial aid that we're making available. We've got the money. So it really is a matter of justice and not just charity that we make the resources available so that students who are admitted can come irrespective of their financial circumstances. A very high percentage of our students will actually pay no tuition fee at all. So I think that's good, and we can probably do more, but we're heading in the right direction. And I think we're setting a good example for our peer institutions, for the Stanfords and the Yales and the Williams and Swarthmores and University of Chicago, for the other wealthy institutions, although I think Chicago's not in the wealth league of the others. But boy, right at the end, you put your finger on something I want to underscore. And that is one of the problems with students being required to take on so much debt in order to attend even state universities in many cases, but certainly private universities. One of the problems is this: the students have no choice but to instrumentalize their education to future employment. They really have no choice because they know they're going to have those debts to pay off. And that undermines the ability of those institutions like mine that are liberal arts institutions to encourage our students to look at their education in a non-instrumental way, to aim for what Cornel calls paideia, recalling that great ancient Greek concept of deep education, not just cheap schooling, not just the conveying of information and imparting of a few skills, but the actual deep wrestling with the best that has been thought and said over the great questions in human life, the great questions of the human condition, the best that has been thought and said by the greatest minds. Cornel mentioned earlier people like Sophocles with his Antigone, or Plato and his dialogues, the great medieval philosophers, the great Enlightenment thinkers, and so forth and so on. Those are wonderful opportunities for those who have them. The trouble is, if we make the education costs go up so high, students are going to feel that that's just a luxury they can't afford. They're going to have to focus on practical disciplines, practical areas of learning that'll pay off so that they can quickly get a job at a high paying rate and be able to pay back these loans. So those of us in education who believe in paideia, who believe in deep education, who believe in liberal arts education, have a real stake in trying to get our own institutions onto the right track when it comes to financial aid and making our education affordable to everyone that we admit.
Okay, we have thank you so much. We have a question here. And
I have
then
a
first
question
here
over
and
here.
then over here. You can just pass the microphone.
I was gonna ask about post like 4-year college, because I know a lot of people that want to go to graduate school, that stuff is not cheap. Like, for example, I want to be a physician's assistant. It's like 55 grand to like actually get into that. And for example, a lot of those people like can't fork out that amount of money as a student. It's not affordable. And it's the same thing with undergrad and the 4 years, but I would say it's insanely worse. Like for people who want to be a doctor, for example, have to fork out 100 to 140K to do that, and then they have to go even more debt. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think that's really sustainable. But like, because my mom, like, for example, she was in college back in the 80s, and you could like actually like work and go to college, but you can't do that anymore. It's it's basically not sustainable. So like, how would you basically fix that? Like, do you think like graduate programs need to be more like basically less cost? Like, how would you fix that in general?
No, when Brother Robbie, my brother, talked about intellectual humility, I think we as Americans have to have a humility in regard to learning from other countries. There's a large number of American students who now go to Canada. I just was up in Montreal. You see the Americans, Toronto, Montreal, how come? After 1 year, it's free. Robbie trained at Oxford, not just Swarthmore, but Harvard and Oxford. Oxford still relatively free, Robbie?
9,000 pounds a year now for the British students.
For the British student, that's how many dollars you
9,000
think?
would be roughly maybe 12 to 13,000 US dollars. It's very
Right, so
different.
that's very, very, very different. And I don't believe in imitation. I don't believe in emulation. I think each nation ought to be distinctive and try to be original, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from other countries as to how it is that they're able to provide high quality, not just education at the college level, but you're talking about the post-college level as well. And we have to keep in mind, it's only about 34% of our precious citizens who even go to college. You got 66% who don't set foot in college at all. And they're just as precious as those who go to college, right? But we got to make sure that even in our discussion that we keep it in a holistic context to understand the dynamics of college versus non-college, Harvard, Yale, University of Florida versus city colleges, community colleges, or whatever. And in doing that, I just think we need to be humble enough to learn and then try to move with new kinds of policies. I mean, I believe that much of higher education should be free, but I mean, we won't get into all of that right now. That's a different conversation. But I do believe that deeply because I think that education is an integral part of how human beings can realize themselves at the highest level.
Thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, I do think over bureaucratization is a really unnecessary cost increaser. Mm-hmm. And we've got to reduce the bureaucratic bloat. Mm-hmm. But I want that to be done in such a way as the beneficiaries of it are the students and the prospective students that get the benefit of that cost savings because they're the ones who are paying for the bureaucratic bloat. Right. It's their money. It's their inflated tuition costs that are paying for the bloat. So if we do find a way, some universities like Purdue have been making some progress on this. If we do find a way to cut it, it needs to, the people who get the savings have to be the students, not some other constituency or stakeholder group. I wanted to add to something Brother Cornel said just a minute ago about the relatively small percentage of our citizens who do end up going to college at all. And that is especially exacerbated among our young men fewer and fewer men going to college. So at all the Ivy League institutions, the majority of students are now women. It's pretty close, 52-48, 53-47. But as you go to other institutions, you see it, the difference expanding, to 60-40, even 65-35. There's some failing of our young men going on here, making college attractive to them, making sure that they're prepared and able to succeed at college, that they're incentivized to want to go to college, to aspire to higher degrees and professions that they're qualified for with college degrees. I think this is having an adverse effect in various areas, including in the marriage market. Marriageable men to women. There's work being done at the University of Virginia by Brad Wilcox and others on that problem. But I do think that we need to pay attention to what is happening in the area of education to our young men and our boys.
Okay, so we have a bunch more questions. Yes.
So I would love for you to speak to state funding for public higher education. Here at Florida Gulf Coast University, we have not increased our tuition in over 9 years. It's about, for in-state students, about $6,200 a year. And the Pell Grant, if you're full Pell, is about $7,400. So a student who's full Pell eligible from any low-income place can come to this university, and the Pell Grant alone can pay the cost of tuition. That's before we even package you or give you scholarships. And so I'd like to speak to higher ed and public good and what the state should be providing to public higher education. In many, many states, we can see that the states are funding less and less of their public universities. And that gap is also being covered by students. I'm proud to be in Florida in a place where we can still go to every low-income community in this state, and we can tell young people, come here and you can actually not have to be in debt. That you can't say that in many states around the country, but we're very proud that you can say that in this state and at Florida Gulf Coast University.
Can you?
Yeah, I say that's good news. I mean, I'm here in New York, so I hear so much bad news coming out of over there in terms of all of the different reforms going on, curriculum debates, and what role slavery plays in the curriculum, ... But I think that we can learn much from Florida in terms of the fusion of these Pell Grants as well as the state funding for your institutions or institutions very much like yours there. So that to me is highly encouraging. I didn't know that, though. Did you know that, Brother Robin?
I did not know that, and highly encouraging is an understatement. That is really something, and you're to be congratulated down there at Gulf Coast for that achievement. It's just almost unbelievable to me that you have not raised tuition fees in 9 years. I'm absolutely flabbergasted by that.
See, Brother Robbie is a parliamentarian of the Princeton faculty. It was always good to see him there when I was there before I left. Took a 50% cut in my salary to teach at Union Seminary. But if he raised that issue to Brother Chris, who's the president of Princeton, freeze it for 9 years, I don't think he had.
I'll be sent into exile.
Can't put him in exile. It'd be like Dante, exile. Ravina, I know.
I'd be lucky to be. I'd be at the fate of Socrates. I said hold freeze tuition.
There you go.
That's wonderful. I'm not sure if she was a professor, but the lady who informed us of that. That's just wonderful news. And I do think if Florida can do it, other states can do it. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, I love your state. There's much that's unique about Florida, but in this area, it's nothing unique about Florida. If Florida has done it, then other states can emulate it.
Okay.
I want to say a word about another category of universities that I don't think we think about enough, but are in a dangerous position right now. And these are tuition-dependent private universities, not the Princetons and the Swarthmores and the Williams and the Stanfords and the Yales. They are not financially vulnerable. They are the opposite of financially vulnerable. They should be spending more money on financial aid. I'm talking about those colleges. Many of them are Catholic colleges for historic reasons in regions all around the country. Some of them are associated or historically were associated with other faiths, and some are non-sectarian. But they are private institutions that are tuition dependent. They depend on enrollments in order to keep the lights on and to pay staff salaries and faculty salaries and so forth. And they are not subsidized at all by states, at least in any meaningful way. They are not subsidized at all. And they cannot afford to compete on price with state institutions. Mm-hmm. And this renders them very vulnerable because they're competing for the same students. So, you know, if it's St. Rose of Lima, who's just outside of Philadelphia, I don't know if this is an actual institution, but just outside of Philadelphia, has probably served working class communities, mostly Catholic, but not exclusively Catholic by any means. Maybe largely Black Protestant population these days they're serving, but have historically served that population. And they're having to compete with one of the Pennsylvania state institutions that can offer education at about half the price. The likelihood is that that institution, St. Rose of Lima's, days are numbered. We're gonna have some contraction. We already are in the academic world, and it's those institutions that are the most vulnerable. And they have done a wonderful job at providing education to working class people for generations after generations after generations. And I would hate to see them lost. So I would like some effort, especially by philanthropy, go into providing those institutions with the resources that will enable them to be competitive for outstanding students with the state institutions. Have you thought about that, Cornel? I know you've spoken at these.
I know. I thought about that in terms of my really wonderful experiences that I've had with precisely the institutions you're talking about. But I hadn't thought about lifting them up and making them crucial in the discourse the way in which you did. And I think you're absolutely right about it. They played a fundamental role in constituting the glue holding society together in terms of the kind of educational institutions that they are. And they are, you know, largely religious, especially Catholic, but otherwise as well.
Yeah, you know, they've been an important element in our historic social mobility when you think about it.
Absolutely.
You know, students who didn't go to the University of Pennsylvania, they went to St. Rose of Lima, but they went on to successful careers. You know, they did not end up in the socioeconomic status of their parents. They were able to rise precisely because of that education. By the way, historically, those institutions, Cornel knows this, but I want to say this to the general audience. Historically, those institutions did insist on students receiving a first-class liberal arts education. They had general education requirements, and I think this had to do with the relation with religion, especially Catholic. They did have general education requirements that required these students to learn Plato, to read Virgil, to read St. Augustine. You know, they got classical educations.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left, and there's a lot of hands up. So you first, and then over here.
And then Chris, if we could take an online question, please.
Oh, we do have, of course.
My name is Dina Sewell, and we live in Naples. I grew up in Norway. I have my education tuition free because that's what the country believes to invest in kids so we all have equal opportunities. I find this discussion about admission to be highly academic. Unless you go to kindergarten and make sure that every kindergartner in this country gets the same opportunity, the same good teacher, well-paid teachers, you can't judge because there's so much a product of the first K through 12.
No, I think you're right, my dear sister. You're absolutely right. And it goes even beyond that, it seems to me. You can have the best kindergarten in the world and have a family that's shattered and a community that's feeble, and therefore the child doesn't even have the backdrop once the class is over. We need, I want to abolish poverty. I want to create it's like in Norway, there's another place where we learn, Sweden would be another, where you create conditions under which the child emerging out of the womb has a certain dignity affirmed in such a way that from kindergarten all the way through death, they're able to live a life of decency. But that's a much, much larger issue. But I agree with you in terms of the larger context being important, going all the way back to childhood.
Can we take a question from online, please? All right, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me, Dr. West and Dr. George.
Oh, we can hear you, my brother.
Has to do with how you would propose organizing a selection committee so that you could utilize a socioeconomic status means of allowing college admissions. How would you prevent bias and discrimination with that process? So that I think the questioner is getting to the fundamentals of the human being involved in making those decisions, whether it's on race or on socioeconomic status. And then here's the kicker with only a few minutes to go. Should artificial intelligence be used to prevent bias and discrimination in a new assessment model for college admissions?
Wow, that's quite a
We have plenty of time, right?
Well,
What a question.
one of the things that you have to worry about in any competitive process, whether it's athletics or college admissions, is cheating, or short of cheating, ingenious ways that people come up with to game the system. And that's going to be true whether your admissions process is race blind or ethnicity blind, or whether there are preferences to some racial categories or classifications. You're going to have that. And no system, again, to go back to what Cornel said at the very beginning, no system is going to be perfect. Some of those are going to slip through. And all you can do is your best to try to weed out the frauds, people making fraudulent claims about themselves or manipulating things in such a way as to give an appearance that they are something that they are not, because people will try to game the system. That's human nature. And we frail, fallen, fallible human beings, we can get up to some real nonsense, real mischief. And we do that when we're in competitions. It happens in sports. It happens in college admissions. You remember that college admissions scandal from, what was maybe Cornell, maybe 5-6 years ago out in California?
USC.
USC, you know, respectable people who were cheating to get their kids into admit, claiming they were athletes when they hadn't even played the sport. So all you can do is the best that you can. But I think we could make real progress here. I mean, I think there are steps that we can take, there are criteria that we can look at. It's beyond my ability to say whether AI has a role in this. I'm sorry about that. Cornell might know better than I do. But I know that there are steps we can take, whether or not they involve AI, to help us to identify talent, latent talent in students who come from relatively humble backgrounds, first generation college, students of families whose household income is less than $60,000 or less than $80,000 a year, people from regions that have historically been very badly, I hate this term, I'm going to use it anyway this time, underrepresented at especially elite universities. Historically, Princeton has not had a lot of Appalachians, has not had a lot of people from farm families. We could take steps to rectify that, which will bring us a new dimension of diversity as well, which would be all to the good. Cornel?
I think here again, I'll fall back on my own Christian sensibility and acknowledge that we're all cracked vessels. Anything we human beings come up with is going to be shot through with bias and prejudice. The best we could do is to try to make sure that the groups that we have are inclusive enough, different colors and genders and so forth, that create bonds of trust such that they're able to be honest and candid. Because the only thing we have against bias is accountability. It's human accountability. That's all we have. And that's what democracy is, which is the best we can do. What kind of human accountability do we have in the face of the powerful, the greedy, the hateful, the spiteful, the cruel, the mean? And all of those come in all colors. There's no doubt about that. So when you have a committee, you want to make sure that committee you have enough voices, enough persons and different ways of life and perspectives that they can come together, create bonds of trust such that they make decisions and recognize they're going to try again, fail better. They're going to try again, fail again, they're going to fail better. They're never going to get it perfectly right. And if anybody tells you they got it perfectly right, they ought to get off the crack pipe. They lie. There's no such thing as perfection among we crack vessels. That doesn't mean we give up. It just means we try. And in the end, as T.S. Eliot says, the rest is not our business. And the last thing we need is the notion of technology as Messiah. Believe me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The last thing we need is thinking it's somehow something made by human beings, which is what AI is going to be salvific and come in to rescue us. No. We're on the road to eugenics at that point. All we got to be is scientific. All we got to do is generate this super intelligence, and they're going to have hypersensitivity. No, things don't work that way. No, not at all.
Okay, we have another question. I know we're getting near the end, so a couple more.
Dr. West and Dr. George, thank you very much for this lovely conversation. It's not much of a debate for me, but it's a very enlightening conversation, and I really appreciate it. My name is Jonathan King Creto. I'm an adjunct professor here and also at Marist College in the Hudson Valley up in New York, where I've been for about 5 years. And I like to reel the questions back on the topic of affirmative action, because I think finances are important, but I think affirmative action is really where it hits home for me. When I did my second bachelor's, I attended a small Jesuit college up in upstate New York, where it was 87% white, 10% Asian, and then I fell in the bucket of others. I spent 2 years there and 2 years studying in Normandy in France, where I saw what merit-based learning looked like. I was the only spot in the entire room my entire time. So with affirmative action, it gave me the opportunity to attend this private Jesuit college in upstate New York and have a space there. Had I been in France trying to apply to a university that's merit-based, if I did not perform well on those entrance examinations, I would have not had any space. So what I'm looking at is when we talk about the Supreme Court case and the Asian students who brought this, they were not fighting to go to schools like FGCU or St. John Fisher in upstate New York, or even Marist College. They're talking about the Stanfords and the Yales and the Princetons. So in your opinion, how fair is it that the education process, the learning process is being disrupted for millions of Americans because of students who fail to get into Ivy League schools when we have students who are just trying to get into community college?
Well, I'm certainly glad that those colleges found you or you found them, and that your latent talent, if it was not on display in the tests and so forth, was discovered. But I don't see any reason in principle why that can't be discovered on the basis of individual assessment. And I'd be surprised if, in fact, it wasn't to some extent a matter of individual assessment, not just that they were looking for black skin and you happen to be it. And that's what I'm pleading for, across the board. Do the work to find the talent. Now, that means you're going to have to reach out to communities where you usually don't find yourself. Well, too bad. It's time to do that. Get into those communities. Find out where the talent is. Know it by name, not skin color. Know it by name. Know what the student's got in him he's got to offer to his fellow students and the achievement that he's capable of and what he's able to contribute to the society. It's really a matter of finding that latent talent. I just don't want people looking at skin color. I want them doing the work to find the latent talent.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to salute you, though, brother. Sounds as if you've had a magnificent experience, and you've taken advantage of it because of your own brilliance and your own talent. But you got to keep in mind, again, dear sister who comes from Norway was making the point about Robbie and I being too academic, and I kind of stewing on that a little bit, because I'm not anti-academy, but I just want the academy to keep it real. And I want to say this, that there would have been no access of black students, even in that college that was 87% white, if it had not been for the civil rights movement and for freedom fighters of all colors, You had a lot of white brothers and sisters who were part of that movement, but it was led by black people. And Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer were at the center of it. They were defenders of affirmative action only because those places had been shut down systematically across the board for black students. I don't know when Florida itself at its the level of public education allowed for black students to gain access. They could go to Evan Waters anytime they wanted to. But when did they gain access to the white mainstream, the Florida states and so forth? I don't know, but my hunch is it was probably right around the time when that pressure was brought to bear by those civil rights activists. And that's very important. That's part of how a democracy works at its best, to accent the ways in which arbitrary power is imposed on persons in an unwarranted way, and they respond to civil disobedience, pressure, so forth and so on. And so that's important to keep in mind. But in the end, like yourself, it's going to be a matter of individual brothers and sisters, no matter what color, being highly disciplined enough and engaged in forms of practice such that they can reach levels of excellence, just like the black musicians. John Coltrane doesn't have to worry about no affirmative action. They got to make action toward him because he embodies the highest level of excellence when it comes to blowing his saxophone. That doesn't mean we're against affirmative action. It just means there's an individual dimension of this that has everything to do with you choosing to be a person of high quality, integrity, honesty, brilliance, excellence, loving your mama, treating your neighbors right, and trying to bear witness before the worms get your body and you pass it on to the next generation. Oh, that's a beautiful thing right there.
And all right, the point that this brother made, reference St. John Chisholm and Jesuit institutions like that. Those are the kinds of institutions, Cornel, I was just talking about.
That's right.
And we have to remember those institutions are in jeopardy right now. The next 10 years could see them collapse. So we need to get the attention of people who are in a position to do something about it, especially philanthropy. Get the attention of those philanthropists to those colleges so that there can be more opportunities like what this brother has experienced.
Absolutely. No, it's a beautiful thing.
All right, well, thank you very much. We're up against the time limit. First, let's have a round of applause for our presenters, Robert George and Cornel West, Christopher Phillips. And I really want to thank Julie Eco and Shelby Smith and John Bledsoe and his team for pulling all this together and getting it out to our friends at USF, UWF, and UNF. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you who are here in Fort Myers, you can see Chris again tonight at 6:30 if you want to continue the debate. And it sounds like we're in the mood to continue the debate. So Chris will be with Glenn Whitehouse over in Reed Hall 236 to continue the conversation with pizza. Okay, pizza is going to be offered. So you're going to be hungry after all of this. And so come on over and continue the conversation. Again, Dr. George, Dr. West, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.